I really don't want to talk about this episode. And it's not anything against this episode, but here's the thing. Raisins is about depression. It's about Stan having a depressive episode after Wendy has broken up with him. But the episode is very infamous for the lines that Butter has at the very end of the episode, where he's all like, oh, by the way, good times and bad times happen, but it is true love that we share. That kind of ending that Butter says to the audience as if it's the quote unquote unexpected thesis for what we just saw. It's not my intention to say that people who get that takeaway from the ending are lesser for that being their takeaway. I think it just goes to show you that South Park is a show directed at adults because the whole point of the episode is to showcase what depression actually looks like. Like, all of Stan's friends rally to try and snap him out of a depressive episode in the most shallow and thoughtless way possible. It's not their fault. They're all depicted as the neurotypical friends who are supposed to help their neurodivergent, depressed friend get better. But it's uncomfortable in the fact that it displays what it is like to have depression when you're surrounded by people who don't know what it's like to have depression and can't empathize with you, and therefore are completely unequipped to help you. I intend to analyze this through the lens of Butters because I think Butters is the character who goes through the quote unquote same journey that Stan does, but Butters, unlike Stan, does not have depression. Now, don't get me wrong, Butters is mentally ill. He has a variety of mental illnesses that do pop up later in the show. Um, but the fact of the matter is that he's not mentally ill in the same way that Stan is, which is why he is very much on board with the same solutions that the others try to remedy Stan with earlier on in the episode before it doesn't work. And it expectedly doesn't work because depression is a lot more complicated than that. When Butters goes with the rest to try and cheer up Stan at the raisins, the server at their table, Mercedes, gives him special attention, and really only him special attention because he's the only one who's giving her that back and forth, you know. I mentioned this in like Walk is Dead, the Butters diegesis episode, but in capitalism, if there is a mentally ill man with a lot of money who's looking for a quick and easy way to get a problem of his solved, one that is internal and one that cannot be solved easily, what he is expected to do sometimes is throw money at conventionally attractive women. Sometimes they're sex workers, and they expect these women to help solve their problems. Well, clearly you have never listened to Pink Floyd's Young Lust because that's what the song is about. Pink Floyd's Young Lust off their album The Wall is about how men seek out these vulnerable women who are only looking for money and maybe other added benefits like sociological status. Basically, sex work is really dangerous because sometimes you can be dealing with very, very unstable men, as we have seen in this current administration with some of the information that is dropped. But I think South Park here is especially progressive in the fact that it calls out the parasiticism on the side of these institutions that pre-mediate the conditions for these places existing in the first place. It's too bad Trey couldn't remember this in the year of our Lord 2008. Oh, well, it is what it is. I'm pretty sure he's learned his lesson. And it is Butters who drinks the metaphorical Kool-Aid in this episode because he falls for the lie that Mercedes is presenting. Throughout this episode, you can see him giving her all kinds of unwanted attention. At the end of her shift, she has to call in a security guard from the place to make sure she can get to her bike safe, which is a very real commentary on the kind of assault that women can face in dangerous situations when men who are obsessed with them single them out one-on-one. There's some very good feminist commentary on how dangerous these jobs can be, but it also is very grounded in the fact that some of the girls that work in positions like this are not the smartest people and therefore are probably going to be trapped in positions like these forever. And multiple times during Mercedes' shift, Butters is just basically showering her with all of this unwanted affection while she should be working. He's dividing his attention between her and the job. She can't be mean to him because he's a customer, and therefore she would lose money if he were to have a negative experience with her. He could even complain to the restaurant about her uh, saying something mean to him, and that could get her fired. Like, Butters is placing this girl in a very unfair position because he has made the also very unfair assumption that she's his girlfriend because she did her job. So the reason this didn't show up in like the Butters diegesis episode is because this is nothing new. We're not learning anything new about Butters. This is basically a rehash of all of his most famous traits being realized in a different context. This is genuinely a Stan episode, but it is also just as important to be able to view it as a Butters episode because it actually has some very unkind things to say about the sex work industry, because that's basically what these girls are doing. They're basically PG prostitutes. Something that people don't talk about with this episode is that Stan isn't attracted to any of the other Raisins girls. And this is because Stan is very heavily implied by the show to not be attracted to her for her looks, but her brain and her personality, which unfortunately is something that is lost on Butters, even to this day. I find it interesting because Butters, you would think, would be the person to understand to not fall in love with a girl based on for how she looks, but he is extremely shallow in what he expects from women. But I can only imagine that's probably a result of the abuse that he's faced in his own home with his own mother. I imagine it's funny because I could have put it in the Butters diegesis if I wanted to, because there's one important character trait that starts here that we continue seeing for the rest of the show, and it's that Butters is incredibly shallow and superficial in his demands of women. He only cares about what they look like and not what they have going on the inside. I'd like to think that this is actually a very psychological thing that's going on with him and his mom, but we're not going to talk about that today. And before we get into the goth kids, there is a moment in this episode that I thought was endlessly fascinating just for what was being said, that I actually want to mention it here. In the middle of the episode, the Raisins girls are doing the YMCA dance. I'm not going to get into a huge diegesis on South Park and queer culture, but South Park actually has some very, very interesting things to say about queer culture, particularly gay men. And this is one of the most interesting things they've ever said about queer culture, because it talks about the appropriation of queer culture by subgroups who are only mildly intersected with that violence but don't understand the full breadth of that violence. Like, the YMCA is a song about having sex with other men at the YMCA back in the 70s, 80s, when they were actually renting out rooms to people. Like, that's a very, like, socio-politically loaded song. And while the surface level aspects of it might culturally intersect with the experience that these girls are going through, like gay men and women, they definitely have a lot of the same problems, but the Raisins girls are appropriating a song about a very specific cultural history regarding gay men without trying to understand any of the socio-political complexities of why the song is the way it is. And like I said, you could make this argument that this is a show of solidarity. But given the fact that these are a bunch of ostensibly straight girls trying to market themselves as sex workers to straight men, it very much does imply that this is a gross and bigoted cultural appropriation of a song made by marginalized people for marginalized people. The goth kids are very, very interesting in the sense that they appear to be a caricature of a very specific kind of person. And this very specific kind of person that they appear to be a caricature of are people who just appropriate the goth look, the goth fashion, without understanding any of the complex socio-political identity associated with being a goth. because it is a very socio-political thing, much like the YMCA is a very socio-politically loaded song. Like, you can't invoke these cultures without inherently saying something political. And the problem is that the goth kids, at least in this episode, and the raisins girls are very much appropriating the aesthetics of what oppression looks like and feels like without understanding why that oppression existed to begin with. The larger connecting tissue between the way the goth kids are and the way the raisins girls act and the way Stan's depression is treated is the marginalization aspect. Stan is marginalized because he had depression. Gay people were marginalized and they had to make power anthems like that just so they could feel good about themselves. And then that eventually gets appropriated and gays are still oppressed. And the goth kids are only parroting like the very surface level aspects of being goth without understanding any of the pain, the trauma, and the suffering that comes with being a goth. Like, it gets revealed later on that the goth kids do actually have very hard lives, but if you hear the things that they're saying in this episode, they very much are a caricature of what it looks like when white people, well-meaning white people, white liberals, come in on a social culture without understanding the social complexities of that culture. Like, on a macro social scale, this is an episode about cultural oppression being realized through a narrative about depression. Now, how does Butters slot into this? Like, he doesn't have depression like Stan, so he's not going to understand what Stan's going through. He might develop depression in the future, but if post-COVID has told us anything, the kind of mental illnesses that Butters has does not overlap into depression, and therefore I do not think he will ever be able to be in a position to understand Stan. Much in the way Kyle doesn't have depression and he's not going to understand Stan. In fact, I'd say the only person in this episode who treats Stan normally is Kenny. He doesn't have a single line or anything in the episode, but I think that's perfect for him because a depressed person just needs someone to passively be there and support them in a real and meaningful way. You can help a depressed person or a traumatized person by choosing to just stay there when times are tough, by choosing to be there even when it is difficult to be there. And if Butters were to have any, like, last line thing to actualize the thesis, it should have been something like that. Instead, what we get, I think, is a comedic take on how a neurotypical receives a neurodivergent person's plea. Like, do you guys even realize that Butters throws a slur at the goth kids? He calls them the F slur, and then he just walks off like nothing happened. Like, Butters didn't actually learn anything from his experience because he's a static character in this episode. And he's a static character in this episode because, quite frankly, he holds a lot of misogynistic beliefs that don't ever really get deconstructed by the show for good reason. He's not in a position in his life to have nuanced opinions about women and why women do the violence they do and participate in the social cultures they do and say the things that they do. Butters is a little kid. He's a little kid with a very bad understanding of the world, and that's what the joke is. In a way, that kind of does make it one of the greatest jokes in all of South Park because nobody got it. And I do think its cultural mythologization is really, really funny. But it actually sucks for me as, like, someone who has a mental illness that's the takeaway from the episode when, like I said, the real takeaway from the episode is that depression and mental illness is actually really, really unpleasant. In fact, this is the real takeaway from the episode because it gets stated again in the "you're too old" and the Asperger's duology. Like, the point of that episode was missed so hard that when Matt and Trey made a spiritual sequel, quote unquote, because it's not really a spiritual sequel, it's only a sequel in, like, ideological themes, people didn't even get the joke then. All they did was say, oh wow, Stan mentally ill, super cool, when actually being mentally ill really, really sucks. And that was the point of the episode. Being mentally ill sucks. Now, this is where I normally would have ended things, But there's this anime that just came out called Chainsmoker Cat. And I've seen a little bit of Chainsmoker Cat, and I actually do plan to do a watch through of it in the future. But it is actually very rare to see a depiction of mental illness, a realistic depiction of mental illness that actually makes the neurotypicals uncomfortable. Like, this isn't your commodifiable, cutesy, ooh woo oh whoa anime girl. This is a semi-realistic depiction of depression and anxiety in a way that makes people uncomfortable, but is absolutely spot on for people who are in that position. And that's only what makes the mythologization of raisins and you're getting old and Asperger's all that more depressing, because it makes you realize that people don't actually care about the mentally ill very much. They only care about romanticized depictions of mentally ill people that fit into their ooh woo cutesy. Mentally ill people are just my quirky little chungus depiction rather than the actual harm and how much it sucks to be mentally ill. Like, being mentally ill can genuinely mess up your social relationships. It can mess up your life. It can do a lot of damage to your reputation as a person. And it's in this fandom that I realized that people really, really don't care if you're mentally ill. And the thing that bothers me most about the cultural mythologization of the Butters line is that it's all mostly done through teenagers who don't understand any of the stuff that I talked about because they don't have that lived experience. It's only a reaffirmation for me that South Park really is for adults, and that if you're a kid, you're not really equipped to understand this show. The fact that people gathered around a joke line that was meant to satirize how neurotypicals or people who don't even share the same mental illness as you can just be as violent to other people with mental illnesses as a neurotypical, got received like that, is just proof to me that fandoms are so ableist and illiterate that they will just make things up in order to justify having a character as their blorbo and just miss the joke and the social commentary behind why someone writes something like that. This is a depressing way to end this diegesis, but there wasn't really going to be a happy ending to this one.